Hey there, and welcome to episode 4 of Flintlock Friday, a show dedicated to you, the viewer, to help you identify these historic rifles and muskets from the Flintlock era, as well as provide you a concise yet informative overview of the deep history within these guns. I'm your host, Reviewer 311, and let's get started. On today's episode, we'll be taking a look at these two models of 1822/28. You can easily refer to these as the model of 1816 Type 3, but since I've been using Peter A. Schmidt very heavily in my readings and how I make my videos, I've been using his nomenclature in my previous videos, so I will continue to use his naming nomenclature for muskets moving forward, so that way I have continuity between the videos. Just let it be known, these all come from the models of 1816 family tree, and that includes the model of 1816, the model of 1822, and the model of 1822/28, which these two muskets are a part of. This one on top was made in Harper's Ferry in 1836, and the one on the bottom was made in Harper's Ferry in 1841. But just know that this all comes from the same family of the model of 1816. So what is the model of 1816? Based off the 1777, America would go on to produce its last military flintlock musket. And as you can see, it doesn't spend its entire life as a flintlock, but that will be covered later. And they produce a lot of them. They produce 700,000 of these flintlock muskets. And if you take into consideration the population of the country was only around 20 million in 1845, when this musket left service, that is a lot of muskets in comparison to the population. And let's talk about that service life. So 20 to 25 years, that means that this musket actually provided a much longer service to the country than a lot of other more famous military arms in American history, to include the M14, the Springfield Krag-Jorgensen, and it has as long of a history as the infamous M1 Grand. So they produce 700,000 of these guns, and they produce them in a lot of different places, 17 places to be exact, at the two national armories, Harper's Ferry Armory and Springfield Armory, as well as 15 contractors and independent makers, to include even the state of Virginia, got in on making these guns. How we got here is we have to look at the Ordnance Department being stood up in 1812, and their goal is to standardize the design and manufacture of U.S. military muskets. Before this, if you've watched my other videos, you know that there were 7 different types of Charleville patterns of muskets being made at just the two national armories. The Ordnance Department comes in, they want to standardize not just the design of the musket, but also the manufacturing. They are looking for component interchangeability, not complete parts interchangeability. They want to take the main components of the musket, the lock, the stock, and the barrel, and have those be able to be swapped out with not that much hassle between the different guns, at least from the two national armories. This is going to be based on the 1812 standard pattern of musket, which comes from Springfield Armory, that, as you can tell, is based very heavily on the French model of 1777. Secretary of War Eustace approves this in 1812, though the production of that standard pattern of 1812 does not enter until 1814. And this is where you run into our first of many naming problems. So this is called the transition muskets nomenclature, and everything that can go wrong will go wrong, because when doing my readings on this book, Peter A. Schmidt and George Moeller actually conflict on the naming conventions. So Peter A. Schmidt is going to argue that the standard musket is a model of 1815 Type 4, and George Moeller will call it the model of 1812 Type 3. And Kent Jones, we might as well throw in another guy in here, he just calls it the pattern 1812 dated 1817 to 1818. And that is that transition period while they're trying to get on one standard design for the U.S. armories to produce their musket patterns. What's interesting is that we can actually look at the design features that they were looking at. They wanted no change in the caliber of the barrel, so it's going to be a 69 caliber musket. The length of the musket barrel is going to be exactly 42 inches. The pattern of the lock is going to be similar to the 1777. The stock is to be made a little longer and larger, and it's not going to have the cutout that would be in the 1777. Though, what was interesting during my readings is that there was American models of muskets that actually did have that cutout, but that doesn't make it to that first 1816. The musket barrels are to undergo proof testing in accordance with the regulations. Mountings conform generally to that of the model 1763, and that is their terminology, not mine. You almost say that the mountings conform to the 1777. The weight of the stand of arms, and to them the stand is going to be musket, bayonet, and ramrod, to be set at 10 pounds. Speaking of stand of arms, one of the commentators asked me, or someone in the comment section asked me about stand of arms. I've read it two different ways. A stand of arms to be the musket, the ramrod, and the bayonet, but you could also include the cartridge box and accoutrements to include the bayonet sheath. But at this point, they call the stand of arms the musket, bayonet, and the rod, no more than 10 pounds. And they are going to be finishing these muskets by polishing the steel. This would become known as a National Armory Bright. And we'll talk about the National Armory Bright and Brown, and then back to Bright again throughout this video. In 1822, you get the first visual change from the 1816, leading this to be known as the model of 1822. And what's important for you to notice is basically the location of the lower sling swivel is no longer its own separate lug. It is actually starting to move to be part of the trigger guard. And to talk about the sling swivels is an interesting point because these are actually riveted in, whereas previously they had been screwed in before the model of 1816, that is. And the reason that they moved from the screw to the rivet is that they found that if a soldier or an infantryman was in the field, they could unscrew it and they had the potential to lose pieces. So to make it dummy proof, they made it riveted, which is always the best decision to do when you are dealing with the infantry. Make everything dumb proof. I say that as a former and very proud infantryman, but you already know that. So the model gun comes out, and let's talk about that model designation. So that is the model gun, and it's going to go out with the gun and their gauges. The inspectors are going to take that to the different national armories to ensure compliance between Springfield and Harper's Ferry, as well as all the contractors, that they are keeping within the strict guidelines set forth out by the Ordnance Department. This whole process would actually stay in place from 1822 until 1848. So the last iteration is the model of 1822/28, the muskets I have in front of me. And that is because the French actually send over one of their latest models of muskets, and you would assume that would be the model of 1822. Springfield makes and creates that model of musket, the 1822/28, and Harper's Ferry is delegated to copying the Springfield musket. Easily the best way to identify a model 1822/28 is the location of the lower sling swivel. The lower sling swivel on a 22/28 is completely integrated into the trigger guard. Now let's talk about that National Armory Bright and National Armory Brown. In 1821, National Armory Brown is looked at as a protective coloring that was going to be put over all the metal components of the muskets. The purpose of that was to reduce rust. Think of like a bluing that would come on later. And that is produced and put into the muskets from 1821 until 1832, and the Browning is discontinued. So if you can look at that, there's actually overlap between the 1822/28. Some of the early ones were being put through that Browning process. As for the effect of the Browning process, I've read a couple different things. If not done correctly, you could actually put the barrel through the metal components through a much more heavy oxidation process. So you could actually rust out the barrels more and the metal parts more with this Browning process if not done correctly. And so they just get rid of it. And in 1832, they return to National Armory Bright, and they actually go back and they take off the Browning from some of the guns. I am curious if anyone knows why that is so important for state inventories. I have a good friend, and he works for a museum in Iowa, and he was going over some records, and they said N.A. Bright for muskets received from one of the American armories. Why would that make a difference? I don't know. If anyone knows or anyone thinks they could figure that out, please leave a comment down below. I'm trying to figure out that. How close to component interchangeability does the model of 1816 and the series of guns actually get? In 1828, a year after the Carrington Commission, remember the Carrington Commission is when John Hancock Hall's model of 1819 rifles are disassembled and found they could be reassembled with completely interchangeable parts. Great for him. But now we are going to do the same thing with the muskets, and it's going to be a very in-depth trial of the muskets. So they are going to take 100 Springfield muskets and 100 Harper's Ferry muskets, they're going to completely break these down to their individual components and see the range in which they differ. And while they don't exactly hit, in no way do they touch what John Hall was able to do, they are able to get to a certain degree in which the main components are interchangeable. In the 1830s, you really get to see the impact that the Industrial Revolution has on the production of arms. With the introduction of more high-speed machinery, they're able to pump these guns out at extraordinary numbers from the national armories to the point that they no longer needed contractors. 134,732 model 1822/28s were made at Harper's Ferry alone, and that's not even including Springfield. So they are able to meet those quota demands, and things just the production of the musket just keeps getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. This is also requiring less skilled labor at the national armories. Like I said, that Industrial Revolution is starting to really gear up in the production of the muskets. Springfield goes off and does the model of 1835, but Harper's Ferry continues to make the model of 1822/28 until 1844. The 1840s is going to be a very important decade for American arms. In 1841, the percussion model of 1841 rifle comes out. In 1842, you have America's first percussion musket, the model of 1842. But the U.S. has tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these flintlocks sitting in storage. And these are almost brand new flintlocks as well. This one's made in 1836 and this one's made in 1841. So in a cost-saving measure, they decide they are going to convert their flintlocks to the updated percussion system. And they're going to break down their entire how many muskets they have in storage and decide which ones will be upgraded. And this is broken down into a class system. Your class 1s are any musket made after 1831. Those will be upgraded to percussion. Your second class is any musket made from 1821 to 1831. Those muskets will be upgraded to percussion. Your class 3 is anything made from 1812 to 1821. Those would remain as flintlocks, but kept in as a sort of reserve. And then your class 4 would be anything made before 1812. Those are antiques. Get rid of them, sell them, and we will get as many of our class 1s and class 2s converted to percussion. And they start doing this in the 1840s and the 1850s and into the 1860s. This conversion to percussion was not done on an ad hoc basis. It was actually done to tens of thousands of these guns, as you could imagine. And according to Kent Jones, he says only 50 to 500 of at least the Springfield flintlocks remain in their original flintlock configuration. Just something for you to know as a collector. Not many flintlocks, especially after 1831, exist. I have some questions to know if this is actually a reconversion, but I'll bring that up as I go over the dimensions. But a lot of them were converted to percussion, and they saw heavy use, especially during the beginning years of the American Civil War. We know the Irish Brigade was using smoothbore muskets with bucket and ball, and that's kind of one of the things I'm not a Civil War, I know the bare minimum, but what I've looked into is I was surprised about how many smoothbores they were using, especially in the beginning. So the model of 1816, the 22, and the 22/28 is going to have that life through the American Civil War, which makes it probably one of the most interesting stories of a musket that we have, because it continues on not in how it continues on and meets its zenith of use in the American Civil War, not in how it was originally designed as a flintlock, but in the new modern percussion system. But that is a general overview of the history of the production of the model of 1816, the 22, and the 22/28. Bear in mind, you can call this a model of 1816 Type 1, a model of 1816 Type 2, or a model of 1816 Type 3. I am in no ways qualified to tell you how to speak in regards to these guns. I am just an amateur collector just trying to learn as much as I can and offload that to you guys out there. But now that we have gotten the muskets out of the way, let's look into specifically these muskets. So let's go over the specifications and the dimensions of this Harper's Ferry model of 1822/28. I'm choosing my flintlock version instead of the percussion because this is an accurate representation of how it would have looked when it left Harper's Ferry Armory. Like I've said earlier, I don't know if this is a reconversion to flintlock, but I'll show you the pros and cons against my thinking later. The overall length of the gun is 57 3/4 inches long. The barrel from breech to muzzle is 42 inches exact, and it is in 69 caliber. The musket is stocked in that beautiful American black walnut, and the overall weight of the musket is 9 pounds. But remember, I don't have a bayonet to put it at 10 pounds, which was the requirement. Beginning the overview for this musket, we'll be starting with the butt plate made of iron held in by 2 screws. One of those screws is set vertically and one is set horizontally. On the tang of the butt plate, you actually have US. Moving forward towards the muzzle, you will see the cone of the stock is not that aggressive. And as mentioned earlier, while heavily based on the 1777, there's going to be a couple things that are different. I'll point out them as we move along. The American 1822/28 does not have that cut out into the stock, neither does the 1822, and neither does the 1816. Moving forward on the bottom of the musket, you will see the trigger guard. The trigger guard does not have those extra supporting grooves that would help the soldier hold the musket, and then we will move to our trigger guard. As mentioned earlier, this is the best way to differentiate between the 1816, the 1822, and the 1822/28 is that this trigger guard has a riveted lower sling swivel built into the trigger guard. Moving up, we have our lock plate, and it's going to say Harper's Ferry 1836 in 3 vertical lines. Moving forward towards the muzzle, you will have the American Eagle with US. And if you notice that eagle, it is facing towards the olive branches. That's a shout out to episode 2. And then as we come up, you'll have that rounded reinforced cock. The reinforced part is that kind of heart part that you see that it's got 2 next to it. And then we have our inclined brass pan. That's one of the best ways to notice if it is a 1777 derivative, is that brass pan. We have our hammer and we have our hammer spring. And then what's really cool is that you start to run into a lot of different markings. We have a V on that hammer. We have the initials underneath the pan. I'll be putting the names of the workmen that these could belong to in the link right here. And then as we move up on top, we have our barrel. Our barrel is held in by a screw as well as these 3 barrel bands. On the tang of the barrel, you will see 1834, which is different than 1836 on the lock plate. Moving up towards the muzzle, you will see the P, that the barrel has been proofed. You'll see the eagle, and you will see the V. And this is where I want to talk about the argument for or against this being a reconversion to Flintlock. The arguments for it being a reconversion is that barrel date does not match that lock plate. So I looked at that, I'm like, oh, I mean, it looks like they did a pretty good job. Looking at the breech on the top, you see no actual machine work, but it is very heavily polished, and it is known that these muskets were actually built, they should have a serial number when they left the factory. I'm like, okay, well, I don't have a serial number. It seems heavily polished. That barrel tang date is off. So those are the arguments for it being a reconversion. These are more of my questions and maybe my arguments against. I'm not completely sold on it, but if we flip the barrel upside down, if we look underneath the breech, you will see that there is actually a serial number there. So if anyone has any idea if they put serial numbers underneath the barrel, and that's what the serial numbers would look like. It has a letter followed by numbers. This one is F15. Underneath the stock, and in the stock you will see 174. Underneath the barrel you will see 174. Also, there's the barrel maker's initials as well as the inspector's initials underneath the barrel. And the big thing for me is that, okay, so the assembly numbers are there as well. There's 3 etched into the breech plug, and there's 3 etched into the bottom of the barrel. I was able to do some more research. I'm like, all right, well, so that matches the 3s that are etched into other parts of the musket, to include the barrel tang screw, as well as the 3s that are in one of the screws that holds in the side plate, and the other side plate is held in by a screw that just has a simple 1. And underneath the trigger guard, if you take that out, there is a 3 etched into the stock. So does that mean that this, does that mean that that stock matches this barrel? I mean, that could be. And then it's the only thing that I couldn't really find to confirm is if there was a 3 on the lock plate or pieces on it, then that could confirm that this is all together. But that's the argument. So I have the same assembly numbers on the barrel as I do have on the stock, even though the barrel is a different year than the lock plate, if you can track all of that. Because if you had swapped out the barrel for a different year, you would have different assembly numbers on the barrel compared to the stock. But if the barrel matches the stock, then that means it's the same. I mean, you can make the argument for that it's the same stock and barrel. Again, I'm not completely married to the idea that this is in its original Flintlock configuration, just because of how rare those are, and then also how Peter A. Schmidt and how Kent W. Johns says that, yeah, they're very hard to come upon. But that's my argument for and against. Hopefully you could keep up with that. And we will close out the rest of the musket. We have our 3 barrel bands, big fan of barrel bands, and then we have our springs. The spring on the lower barrel band is facing towards the muzzle, another key identifier when looking at a 1777 style of musket. We have our middle barrel band that is also held in by a spring, and you can see the riveted sling swivel there. We move forward, we have our nose cap barrel band also held in by a spring. And this is another difference between this and a model 1777 derivative musket. The French muskets have their bayonet lugs on the bottom, whereas the Americans have ours up on top. As far as that is basically a general overview of the musket. Let me know what your thoughts are on this whole reconfiguration or reconversion or conversion argument. Do you think that this is in its original Flintlock configuration because the barrel has matching assembly numbers for the stock? Or do you think this is a reconversion because that barrel year date is different than the lock plate date? If you know anybody that would be able to provide a more educated answer, I would love to hear it. In conclusion, that is the end of episode 4. Thanks for coming along with me as I go over the family lineage of these muskets. So that is the model of 1816, the model of 1822, and the model of 1822/28. It's visually one of my favorite looking flintlocks that I've ever had. Actually, this is how I got into collecting, is that the conversion behind me, I randomly picked up at a gun show a few years ago, and I had no idea what it was, and I went home and I actually bought that musket and I went to Harper's Ferry on the same day. And when I was at Harper's Ferry, I bought the books by Peter A. Schmidt, and I came back and I did I was trying to figure out what it is, because I saw 1841. Oh, so it's a model 1841. I didn't know anything. And then the more I looked and the more I learned about the inspector's marks and how the process is, and then how cool it is that I was able to go to Harper's Ferry on the day that I purchased that conversion. It basically kicked me off and set me off on this whole sort of passion project I've been having for Harper's Ferry muskets. But that's my own story aside. Let me know if you see that I said anything wrong. Please, 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 if there's something I get wrong, leave a comment down below. I want to know what I'm getting wrong, and if you like what I do here, if you want to see more of it, it does help the channel. If you comment, subscribe, you hear it all the time, but that really does drive the algorithm. And until the next episode of Flintlock Friday, I want to say thank you for watching, for spending your time with me, and have a good one.